What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another episode. Today, we're going to be designing and laying out a homestead from scratch. And I'm going to show you all how to do that on this board here behind me. Now, whether your homestead's 2 acres or 3 or 5 acres, the same principles are going to apply when we're designing this out. So make sure to stick with me till the end so that you get all the information. Let's jump into it. So you bought a house on 5 acres and you're starting from scratch with your homestead. Here's how I would specifically lay out the homestead. Again, this is just my opinion, but the first thing you need to start with are what are your goals? What do you actually want to do on the homestead? That's going to dictate how you're going to lay out your design. I'm assuming most people that are going to start homesteading, they're going to, for one, want to have some type of vegetable garden, and they're going to want to have some animals. But here's the thing, you can't do everything. So if you're thinking you want to have every animal known to man, and you want to grow every vegetable known to man, it's not going to happen. It's going to be too much. You're biting off more than you can chew. And so I would recommend starting with the vegetable garden and with the animals, and then also with fruit trees and fruit shrubs, because you're going to want to allow those fruit trees to get going so they begin to produce fruit for you. Now, if you're wanting to get animals, the first thing before you get a single animal, other than chickens, obviously, if you're getting some larger livestock, the first thing you need to do is have a perimeter fence. Whether that's woven wire fencing or whether that's barbed wire, you're going to want to have that set up. So let's just assume the homestead already has it, or that you're going to put that in place. So this line I'm drawing here is just your perimeter fence. Now I know your 5 acres may be laid out a little bit differently. Just for the sake of simplicity, we're laying it out like this. So you've got your perimeter fence set on the whole 5 acres. So before you get any large livestock, that perimeter fence is in place. Trust me, everyone who runs livestock and raises livestock knows how important a perimeter fence is. Animals that get out are a nuisance. It's going to make enemies with your neighbors quickly, and animals are expensive, and so you don't want them to get lost. So you've got your perimeter fence laid out, and here is your home. So when you think about your home, you want to think of this as like zone 1. This is where you're going to spend the most amount of your time, and the places you're going to frequently visit on your homestead, specifically the garden and especially chickens. You want to have those somewhat nearby the house. You're going to be collecting eggs. You're going to be going to your garden probably on a daily basis to harvest things, weed, check on the crops. So we're going to want to put those relatively close. And if you're starting out, that's where I would recommend starting. Garden and chickens. Chickens are an entry point livestock animal. They're pretty easy to manage. I would recommend starting there before you get large livestock, just to get your feet wet. So you've got a couple different options when it comes to raising chickens. You can do a static chicken coop, which is just a stationary location where the chickens don't move around. They just stay in one set location. Or you can rotate chickens around with a mobile chicken coop. That's what we do. I personally like that a little bit better. It gives you a little bit of versatility on the way you want to raise the chickens. They also can forage a lot more if they're rotated around on pasture. But let's just assume you're going to do a static chicken coop location. I would put this relatively close to the house. So over here you can do your chicken yard or your chickens. This would be a chicken coop. You'd also have a chicken run for them to go out and forage on things. And you could also have a gate on here to where if you wanted to let them free range, you could open up the gate and they could run around and forage and whatnot. This is probably the easiest route, is doing a stationary chicken coop. Again, I personally prefer a mobile chicken coop because you can move that chicken coop around. And again, if you did want to set your chicken coop in a stationary location at times, you totally could do it with the mobile chicken coop. It just gives you a lot of versatility, in my opinion. And also, if you ever leave this homestead, you can take that mobile chicken coop with you. Now, I'm going to assume that this homestead is facing south. You want your homestead to face south if possible, because you want to have the most amount of sun exposure, not only for your pastures, but also for your garden. If this is a northern facing property and it's on a northern facing slope, you're going to be really limited with sun. So with this homestead facing south, let's assume you have some pasture and some woods. And so let's say over here on this side, my trees don't look very pretty, but let's just assume that you've got a forest here on this side of the property. Now I know this isn't going to be exact to the way every homestead is laid out, but we're going to assume that you've got a good amount of that over here. Okay. Now, preferably if you have both pasture and some woods, that's going to be really beneficial, because not only are you going to have the opportunity to harvest firewood on your property. But I personally like the ability to be able to run chickens and run animals and rotate them around through pasture. Animals like shade. There's also a ton of forage, in my opinion, for animals to be able to forage on in woods. So we're going to assume about half of your property is forest, and the other half over here is going to be pasture. And so I'm going to draw another perimeter fence right here. And this is going to be your whole pasture area. You got your home here, you got your chicken coop, and then we're going to put our gardens down here. Again, we want this garden to be relatively close to the home. So we're going to do our garden here. I'm just doing garden rows. I would run those garden rows east and west, okay? I would not run them north and south. Everyone has a difference of opinion there. I've done it both ways. I prefer east and west. You're just going to get the best amount of sun exposure by running those east and west versus north and south. I think it also helps with water retention and runoff. It's going to hold that water a little bit better in the garden. So we've got all of our forest over here on the right. We've got everything over here on the left. We've got our chicken coop. Now, whether this is a mobile coop or whether it's a stationary coop, again, I'd recommend mobile because you can move that chicken coop around, not only through the forest, but also on the pasture. Now, the other thing I'd recommend doing is putting in an orchard. Now, I'm going to make a space for it down here. You wouldn't have to lay it out like this. I'm just putting it here so that we can make this the pasture section. We don't want to take up all the pasture with orchard. So this is going to be your orchard. And you can do the deep mulch style where you just basically plant out your orchard and lay down like a foot of mulch. That's going to really benefit those fungi loving trees. And so that's the way I would personally lay out an orchard. And you can also do along your edges here, you can do blackberries. So let's say down here, you could do a big row of blackberries and other brambles. You could do blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, but those tend to do well in rows. And so you can use your edges of your property, maybe even up here along the driveway, you could do another row of berries. And you can use your fence rows and your edges really well for those types of crops. Now, obviously with your orchard, that's going to probably take you, I would say 5 years before you're really getting some fruit off of that. Now, some fruit trees that don't look past, one that I especially love is figs. Generally, by year 2, you can begin to get figs. If you've never had fresh figs off of a tree, then you're missing out. Let's just put it that way. There's a million different varieties, very low pest pressure. And one thing with the orchard is do a ton of research. Try to find local people that are growing good varieties of fruit trees that don't have a lot of pest pressure. Depending upon where you're at, certain fruit trees may have a ton of pest pressure and may not do well based on in your climate. So I would heavily encourage you to do a ton of research before you spend the money on your orchard and make sure you plant the right varieties of trees. But this is going to provide fruit for you and your family. That's going to be really crucial. And because you're going to be planting a different variety of fruits, you can potentially have fruit year round, or especially for 8 months out of the year. And things like stone fruits, apples, and pears, they can actually store very well. So when you get that fall harvest of apples and pears, for example, you can store those in a root cellar. You can store them in the refrigerator. There's a lot of options. But that will give you fruit through the winter when you're not getting fruit production. Now over here, we've got our pasture. Now, whether you're wanting to get cows, sheep, or milk cow, dairy goats, you've got a few different options. But one thing to take into consideration is you don't have a ton of pasture. Let's just say hypothetically, this is 2.5 to 3 acre pasture. What I would do is I would set this up and separate this pasture out into paddocks. You're going to rotationally graze. Do not go and set graze animals out into the pasture. You could just open this up and let 2 cows go out here and just graze. But what's going to happen when you set graze is you're going to overgraze certain species, because just like humans, we tend to go towards the tastiest type of food, and livestock is the same way. So if you just graze them out there, you're going to overgraze certain species. And so I would highly recommend rotationally grazing. You can set this up into multiple paddocks. So let's take, for example, that we are going to break this off into 1/4 acre paddocks. Okay. Now you can do this with electric strand, or you can do this with Premier One electric fencing. It's like a netting. I use it a lot. If you look on my YouTube channel, you'll see me utilizing it with our sheep as well as with our chickens. And so you can rotate these animals through each of these paddocks. This is going to allow you to really build up your pasture. It's going to give each paddock good rest. and it's going to allow your pasture to thrive. And ultimately, if you do a rotationally grazing system, you're going to be really building up the forage in your pastures really, really well. And so over time, you may actually be able to stock more animals on this section of pasture because you're managing it correctly. Now, if you're wanting to get a dairy cow or you're wanting to get a cow calf pair, I would not get more than 2. Okay. Because what you don't want to do is get more animals than this pasture can support. So I would start out with less animals than more animals, because you don't want to overgraze or not have enough pasture for those animals to graze on. So let's say you're going to get some sheep or some cows. I personally love those animals, the ruminants. They can thrive on grass. You don't have a lot of grain input. Now, some of you may be wanting to get pigs. I totally get it. Pigs are great, but they do have a pretty heavy grain input. And the same thing with meat chickens, raising chickens for meat. That's separate from your egg laying flock. Meat chickens are great. You can run these out on this pasture as well, but just be prepared. You're going to have a pretty heavy grain input. And that's personally why I love ruminants, because it's a little bit more self-sufficient. You don't have that heavy amount of grain input. So we've got this here, and you're going to rotate these animals through these paddocks based on the recommendation in your area. If you're in a climate like we are, we're in the southeastern United States, we get pretty good rainfall, then you should be able to stock these and manage this pasture pretty well with a decent amount of rainfall. If you're in a really dry climate, then again, I would just use your local resources, your local NRCS office. There's a ton of resources locally that you can utilize. Ask other farmers, what is the stocking density, to figure out how many animals you can actually put on this property. So let's assume you're going to get some sheep to raise grass-fed lamb. Let's say maybe you're going to have one dairy cow, and then you're also going to do some pasture-raised broilers. You can use any section here. You can also use the woods to raise those broilers out on pasture and through the woods. That's going to help reduce a little bit of that grain input, but you're still going to have a pretty high amount of grain input for those meat chickens. So when you're moving these animals through these paddocks, whether you're using Premier One electric fencing or whether you're going to be using a single wire strand of electric wire, you're going to want to have those animals trained up to that. I'm specifically talking about the larger livestock, not the chickens. So it may be helpful on your property to set up a pen in an area. So when you get new animals, this is going to be a holding pen for them. This is also going to be the area where you're going to manage those animals. Let's say you need to deworm the sheep. Let's just say you need to handle a larger animal. Then you're going to want to do that in this pen. You can also set up some chutes in this area. You can set it up however you want, but when you get those animals on your homestead, you don't want to turn them out loose into the pasture. You want to set them up in this pen to kind of just get used to you and get used to the property. When animals get moved, they're stressed out and they need some time just to adjust and get rid of that stress. So that's where you're going to set them up. This is going to be a reinforced pen. I would use hog panels or cattle panels and set this up to where you can bring the animals in onto your homestead. They will go straight into this pen, I'd say for a week, maybe 2 weeks, before you begin to rotate them around through your paddocks. Also, when those animals are in this pen, those larger livestock, this is where you're going to want to train them up to electric fencing. If they're not used to electric fencing, do not just turn them out into the pasture with electric fence if they're not trained up to it. You can run a strand of electric through this pen after they've been there for a little bit, or you can set up a section of electric Premier One netting and allow them to go up to it and get shocked. They're going to get used to it. It won't take them but probably 3 times of getting shocked before they realize, hey, I don't need to touch that. But you want to do it in the pen. That way, if they get startled, they're not going to run through a fence and be off of your property and you've lost your animal. So I would definitely set up some form of a holding pen. And then from there, you can begin the rotational system with those animals. Again, whether this is a cow-calf pair, whether this is sheep, or whether this is a dairy cow, set it up that way and make sure you do what I'm telling you here so that you don't end up losing your animals. Now, if you're planning on getting goats, I'm not a goat expert, but I can tell you that goats are professionals at escaping. I personally just don't like goats for that very reason. They're escape artists. If you're going to get goats, though, I would talk with someone that is breeding goats well and can give you a little bit more information and tidbits on raising goats and how to prevent them from escaping. There's nothing worse than a loose goat. They're very destructive. You just trust me. Now, with this rotational grazing system in these paddocks, you're going to need the ability, once you rotate these animals from this paddock to this one and on down all the way to the bottom, well, at that point, you've got to have the ability to get them back to the very beginning. So one option is to split all of these paddocks in half. So, or you could just do this with an electric strand. You can set it up in multiple ways, but you want to have the ability to rotate these animals through each paddock. And once they get down to the bottom, they'll come to this one and back on up. Now, I can't tell you how often rotate them because that just depends on your forage and species that you have growing. But I would say under a week. So every 5 days, if not quicker, you need to be moving those animals to a new paddock. So you don't have to split them in half like that, but you do need the ability, if you have long rectangular paddocks like I just showed you, you do need to have the ability of, once they're down here at the bottom, you need the ability to run them back up to this top paddock, whether that's with a long chute or whether, sheep will follow you. So like once sheep get trained up to you, I can just hold a feed bucket and they'll follow me wherever I want. So I could take them from here and I could run them all the way back up here to this very top paddock. Again, or you can split it up into more paddocks, and then you would just rotate the animals even faster because your paddock size is smaller. Now, when it comes to water, we don't have water lines run because our side pasture is leased. I also just don't think running water lines is really necessary on this size of acreage. So you could set up your water buckets in each corner of the paddock, and also you could set them up here. And so you only would need a few buckets. And once they're moved from this paddock, just move them down here, fill the water tank up. And so you wouldn't have to have a water tank in each of the paddock. But if you're going to split all of these in half, like you see here, and rotate the animals down and then back up, you obviously would need to get water to each paddock. You can do that by running a water hose, carrying 5-gallon buckets. That may sound like a lot, but with this size of acreage, you don't have a ton of animals just blazing through a ton of water. So you can fill up a water tank with a few 5-gallon buckets pretty easily. And it's just a little bit of exercise. So just look at the positive side of that. And so I wanted to hit on a little bit more of how to actually set up the paddocks and how to rotate the animals through it. Now, the other thing you can do out here in the forest, if you like mushrooms, is you can inoculate mushroom logs in the forest. That's where they typically grow really well. And so let's say you wanted to set up some mushrooms up here in the forest. Just kind of do a mushroom area. That's one of the cool things about having forests. I love having forests. Again, it gives you firewood. You can do mushrooms, and you can also rotate animals through this forest. You could rotate pigs through here. Pigs love the forest. I wouldn't put pigs out on the pasture. They're going to absolutely destroy it. And so they can go through and root in this forest over here, and you could raise those pigs. You're still going to have some grain input. But I personally, if you're going to raise pigs, do it in the forest. Now in the garden here, I would heavily encourage you to focus on storage crops. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, winter squash, onions, garlic. You can do, obviously tomatoes and cucumbers, and you can pickle all kinds of stuff. But really just have fun with the garden. It's something that I think you've just got to dive into and learn. Don't try to grow 25 different crops. Start out your first year, maybe grow 10. Just get your feet wet if you've never grown anything before. If you're going to try to grow 30 different crops in this garden you've never gardened, it's going to be a disaster. So I would encourage you to do like 10 crops and get really good at those, and then you can expand the garden if you wanted to and start to grow more crops. Now, one other thing is if you had a creek running through here, that would be really cool. Or if you've got a pond on the property, even better. But if you have some natural water source like a pond or a creek, that just is an added benefit to the homestead. We personally don't have that. I wish we did. Maybe on our next homestead we will. But that just helps a ton because then you've got a water source, not only for animals, but also just having a water source is an added benefit. If something ever did happen and you didn't have your water source at home, whether your well run dry or whether something's going on in the country and you don't have a municipal water source anymore, you could obtain water from the creek or a pond. The other thing you can do for water security is you could do some rainwater tanks. Maybe off your chicken coop if you've got a pretty large covered area or a good roof size. And you could also set up some rain tanks on the house. I think this is an affordable option to get rainwater and water security on your property. And so the one thing I don't want to forget about is you will need some type of barn or some type of structure. Now, most people think of a barn and they think of this, $100,000 barn. You don't need anything fancy. All you need enough area, covered area, and let's say it's up here. Let's say let's just remove this row of blackberries, and let's say you got a rectangular barn up here. And what's going to be great about this is you're going to need a place to store hay in the winter. You're going to be probably feeding hay in the winter to those livestock when they need it. Also, to be able to store equipment, whether that's a tiller, whether that's a small tractor, a four-wheeler, a side-by-side, you're going to need an outbuilding to store stuff. Now, you can do it in the garage. You can pull it off without a barn. We don't have a barn right now. But at the bare minimum, like a large storage shed would be incredibly beneficial to have on the homestead. There's a lot more stuff that you need to store than you think. Now, I want to touch back here on the garden real quick. A lot of people think that you need a greenhouse or some type of hoop house. Now, if you can get your hands on that for an affordable price, then I do highly recommend it. It is helpful, but you don't necessarily have to have it. You can grow all your seedling starts on a grow rack with grow lights on it inside or in your garage. And that works great. We still do that to this day. We do have a hoop house structure, but you can grow all of your annuals in here during the normal growing season. You don't necessarily have to have a big hoop house. Again, if you can get your hands on it, even better. Now, additionally, down the line, you could set up some bees right on the edge of the forest somewhere, up here, down here. Doesn't really matter, but that would give you honey. Now, I'm not a bee expert by any means, but I'm just giving you that as an additional idea. Now, when it comes to the garden, most people's soil is pretty poor. So you're going to need to bring in organic matter. If I had to boil down garden fertility to one thing, it would be compost. You're going to have to haul in some compost to this garden and just get a good quality local compost. Make sure there's not trash and stuff in it. Make sure it smells good. And you're going to bring a lot of that in to establish these gardens. Again, if I just had to boil it down to one thing, it comes down to that. If you bring in good quality compost, you till that and work that into your soil just one time, then you're going to have a really fruitful garden. So with this homestead setup, you've got eggs from your chickens. You're going to run some meat birds out on the pasture, so you'll have frozen chicken. You can do one round per year. Let's say 50, 75 chickens. So you've got chicken. If you're doing grass-fed lamb or you're doing a cow-calf pair, you're going to have red meat. So you'll have grass-fed lamb or you're going to have beef. If you're doing a dairy cow, let's just say you are. That is a lot of work, I'll just say, because you've got to milk that thing every day. That's why I don't love dairy animals. Let's say you've got dairy, whether you're doing goat's milk or you're doing a dairy cow. You can do that with this amount of space on your homestead. So then you've got dairy. So we got meat, we got dairy, we got eggs, vegetables from the garden, and we've got fruit. In my opinion, most people can thrive on all of those items. And I know I'm not hitting on everything on this, but this is just where I would start if I was starting a homestead from scratch. If you have anything you'd add to this or you have questions, put them down in the comments. I hope you found this helpful. We'll catch you on the next one.